The most secure prison in America does not announce itself with chaos. There are no towering medieval walls, no dramatic sirens echoing across stormy skies, no crowds gathering outside iron gates. From a distance, the facility almost disappears into the Colorado desert. Flat concrete, clean geometry, fences stretching across dry land beneath endless sky. But hidden inside that silence is one of the most controlled environments ever created by the American prison system. This is ADX Florence, a place designed not simply to imprison dangerous men, but to isolate them from the world itself. Long before the public learned its nickname, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, federal officials already understood what this prison represented. ADX was not built for ordinary incarceration. It was built because the government believed some inmates could no longer be managed anywhere else. And inside these walls, human contact itself became privilege. The prison sits in southern Colorado, surrounded by mountains and desert terrain that feel intentionally empty. The isolation begins before anyone even enters the building. There are no nearby cities pressing against the perimeter. No sense of ordinary life just beyond the fence line. Everything about the location communicates distance. Distance from society. Distance from distraction. Distance from humanity itself. ADX Florence officially opened in 1994 after a series of violent incidents inside federal prisons during the 1980s. Correctional officers had been attacked and killed. Gang leaders continued directing criminal organizations from behind bars. Escape attempts became increasingly sophisticated. Federal authorities reached a conclusion. Traditional maximum security prisons were no longer enough for certain inmates. So they built something different, something designed around absolute control. Inside ADX, every movement is engineered. Every hallway, every reinforced door, every surveillance camera serves the same purpose, eliminating unpredictability. The architecture itself functions like a psychological system. Windows are narrow and angled, so inmates cannot fully see the outside world. Cell doors are solid steel. Movement is coordinated electronically from secure control rooms. Prisoners rarely encounter one another face to face. Even sound behaves differently inside the facility, absorbed by concrete corridors built to suppress communication. The silence is intentional. And for the men housed there, silence eventually becomes its own kind of punishment. The inmates sent to ADX Florence are not ordinary prisoners. Some were convicted terrorists, whose crimes reshaped national security policy. Others were leaders of violent criminal organizations. Some committed murders, while already serving prison sentences in other facilities. A few repeatedly assaulted correctional officers or orchestrated violence from behind bars. Federal authorities viewed ADX as the final option, the place reserved for inmates considered too dangerous for every other prison in the country. But what makes ADX different is not only who enters. It is how they live once the door closes behind them. An ADX cell measures roughly 7 feet by 12 feet. Almost everything inside is made from poured concrete. The bed, the desk, even the stool. The toilet is stainless steel. The sink operates automatically. Nothing is designed for comfort, and nothing can easily be dismantled or turned into a weapon. Even the smallest details reinforce control. The window is only a few inches wide, positioned high enough that inmates can see little more than sky. They cannot look directly at the surrounding mountains or the horizon beyond the prison walls. The outside world becomes abstract, something remembered rather than experienced. For most inmates, life inside ADX means spending 23 hours per day alone in that cell. Meals arrive through a slot in the steel door. There are no cafeterias, no shared tables, no conversations during breakfast, no casual interaction in hallways. The prison removes nearly every ordinary form of human contact, and over time, the absence becomes difficult to describe. At approximately 6 each morning, the lights turn on. Breakfast is delivered through the slot. Officers communicate briefly, professionally, often without extended conversation. Every action follows procedure. The routine repeats with mechanical precision. Wake, eat, read, exercise, sleep, repeat. Days blur together until weeks begin losing distinction. For 1 hour each day, inmates may leave their cells for recreation. But even recreation happens alone. Before movement begins, prisoners are handcuffed through the slot in the door. Shackles are applied. Officers escort them through monitored corridors lined with cameras and electronically controlled doors. The recreation area itself is often described by former inmates as resembling a concrete dog run. High walls, metal grating overhead, no social interaction, no freedom. Some inmates walk in circles for the entire hour. Others perform intense exercise routines simply to preserve mental stability. A few stare silently upward at the narrow patch of visible sky. Then the hour ends. The inmate is escorted back to the cell. The steel door closes again, and the silence returns. But inside ADX, the visible routine is only part of the experience. The psychological routine matters even more. Human beings are built around connection. Conversation helps organize thought. Eye contact reinforces identity. Physical presence regulates emotion in ways most people never consciously notice. Inside ADX, those experiences are drastically reduced. Former inmates have described losing their sense of time. Some created rigid personal schedules just to maintain structure inside endless repetition. Others memorized books, counted steps across the floor, or exercised obsessively to prevent their minds from drifting. Because in prolonged isolation, the mind begins searching for stimulation wherever it can find it. Some inmates talk to themselves simply to hear a human voice. Others replay memories repeatedly until the past feels more vivid than the present. For inmates serving life sentences, the psychological weight becomes even heavier. There is no countdown toward release, no approaching freedom to focus on. Progress is measured differently here. Perhaps an inmate earns slightly more recreation time, perhaps limited privileges, perhaps transfer into a less restrictive unit after years of compliance. But inside ADX, even improvement happens slowly, and sometimes not at all. The Federal Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX Florence is necessary to protect staff, inmates, and the public from individuals considered exceptionally dangerous. Supporters point to lower violence rates inside the facility compared to other maximum security prisons. Critics argue the isolation itself creates another kind of damage, a quieter one that unfolds over years instead of moments. Because ADX Florence does not rely on visible brutality to maintain control. It relies on separation. No riots echo through the corridors. No crowded prison yards dominate headlines. Instead, there is order, extreme order, an environment so controlled that even silence becomes part of the system itself. And for the men inside those concrete cells, the hardest battle is often not physical survival. It is enduring what happens when human contact slowly disappears. Inside ADX Florence, time does not move normally. In most prisons, inmates measure life through interaction. Conversations in the yard, arguments in crowded cafeterias, the noise of shared routines. Even in maximum security facilities, prisoners still experience movement, unpredictability, and human presence. ADX removes almost all of it. The result is not simply loneliness. It is engineered separation. And after enough years inside that environment, separation begins changing the way people think. The most restrictive housing units inside ADX are designed to eliminate nearly every opportunity for influence, coordination, or spontaneous contact. Federal officials believed this level of control was necessary for inmates considered capable of organizing violence even from prison cells. The architecture reflects that philosophy. Doors operate electronically. Hallways remain under constant surveillance. Movement follows strict choreography controlled by staff from secure stations. Inmates rarely see one another directly. Communication between prisoners is intentionally difficult. Even voices are muted by concrete walls designed to absorb sound. Inside the facility, silence becomes part of the infrastructure itself. For some inmates, The psychological impact begins slowly. At first, routines provide stability. Exercise, reading, writing letters, memorizing schedules, anything that creates structure against the emptiness of repetition. But over time, repetition itself becomes exhausting. Days lose distinction. Weeks begin dissolving into one another. Without meaningful social interaction, memory starts behaving differently. Some former inmates described difficulty recalling when certain events happened because every day felt nearly identical to the one before it. Morning lights, meals through the slot, 1 hour alone in recreation, back to the cell, the same walls, the same silence, again and again. To prevent total institutional stagnation, ADX operates what is known as the step-down program. In theory, the system allows inmates to gradually earn additional privileges and reduced restrictions through long-term compliance. The process moves in phases. Prisoners demonstrating stable behavior may eventually receive slightly increased interaction, limited programming opportunities, or transfer into less restrictive housing units. But progress is extremely slow. One disciplinary infraction can reverse years of advancement. An argument with staff, refusing an order, damaging property, even relatively small violations can reset the process entirely. For inmates who have already spent years in isolation, losing progress becomes psychologically devastating. Some continue trying anyway. Others eventually stop believing the system will ever change their conditions. And for certain prisoners serving life sentences, the step-down program does not lead toward freedom, only towards slightly less isolation. That reality changes the meaning of hope inside ADX. Outside prison walls, most people think of progress as movement toward something larger. Release, redemption, another chapter of life. Inside ADX, progress may mean being allowed to speak briefly with another inmate during a controlled program years into the future. That becomes the milestone. The human mind adapts in strange ways when deprived of normal connection. Some inmates create intensely rigid daily routines to preserve psychological stability. Thousands of push-ups every week. Walking precise patterns across the cell floor. Reading entire books repeatedly until passages become memorized. Others turn inward. Former inmates and legal advocates have described hallucinations, panic attacks, depression, and emotional detachment developing after prolonged isolation. Some prisoners reportedly held imaginary conversations simply to simulate interaction. Because the brain does not stop searching for human connection, simply because the environment removes it. It compensates. Sometimes in healthy ways, sometimes not. The Bureau of Prisons states that mental health services are available inside ADX Florence. Psychologists conduct evaluations. Treatment plans exist for inmates requiring psychiatric care. Specialized units have been created following lawsuits and criticism surrounding conditions of prolonged solitary confinement. But therapy inside a Supermax prison is unlike therapy anywhere else. Sessions often occur through barriers. Conversations are monitored. Trust exists inside an environment built almost entirely around surveillance and control. Critics argue that isolation itself can intensify psychological instability, especially for inmates already struggling with mental illness before arriving at ADX. Supporters counter that the facility houses individuals whose histories of violence require extraordinary security measures. Both perspectives exist simultaneously inside the debate surrounding the prison, and neither side fully resolves the deeper question. What happens to a person when isolation becomes permanent? For inmates serving decades inside ADX, outside life slowly transforms into something distant and unfamiliar. Technology changes. Families age. Entire periods of history pass beyond the walls, while routines inside remain almost identical year after year. Family visits, when permitted, occur behind thick, reinforced glass. No physical contact. No handshakes. No hugs from children. Conversations happen through monitored phones separated by barriers. Then the visit ends. The inmate returns to the cell. The family leaves the facility and continues living in a world still moving forward. Inside ADX, movement feels different, almost suspended, and eventually many outside relationships begin fading. Letters arrive less frequently. Phone calls become shorter. Some family members move away emotionally. Others die during long sentences. In some cases, communication stops completely without ceremony or announcement. One day the mail simply does not come anymore. Inside a prison designed around separation, that silence carries enormous weight. But ADX Florence was never built only to isolate individuals physically. It was designed to dismantle influence. Before the creation of modern Supermax facilities, certain inmates continued directing criminal organizations from prison. Gang leaders communicated through shared yards, coded messages, and personal networks built inside traditional correctional systems. ADX attempted to eliminate those opportunities. No group meals. No large recreation yards. No spontaneous gatherings. Communication is screened carefully. Letters are reviewed. Phone calls monitored. Even seemingly harmless language may trigger investigation if officials suspect coded messaging. The prison structure interrupts organization by interrupting human contact itself. For federal authorities, that system represents security. For inmates, it can feel like identity slowly dissolving. Who are you when nobody can physically see you? When reputation exists mostly through memory? When years pass without ordinary social interaction? Some inmates cling harder to ideology or routine. Others withdraw emotionally. A few reportedly stop caring about time altogether. Because inside ADX Florence, survival is rarely about physical violence. It is psychological endurance. And in a place where silence is policy, the greatest struggle often happens entirely inside the human mind. By the time an inmate fully understands ADX Florence, years may already be gone. The routines become automatic. Wake beneath fluorescent lights. Eat alone. Exercise alone. Think alone. Inside the most isolated prison in America, survival often depends on accepting repetition without letting it erase identity completely. And that may be the hardest challenge the facility creates. ADX Florence was designed around one central idea: control without chaos. Unlike older prisons famous for riots, violent yard battles, or dramatic escape attempts, ADX rarely appears in headlines because visible disorder is extremely uncommon. The system works precisely because nearly every opportunity for disorder has already been removed. Movement is controlled. Communication is controlled. Human interaction itself is controlled. Supporters of the prison argue that this structure has succeeded exactly as intended. Assaults on correctional officers are far lower than in many other maximum security facilities. High-risk inmates who once organized violence from prison have far fewer opportunities to influence others. For federal authorities, ADX represents stability, a place where unpredictability has been minimized through architecture, procedure, and isolation. But critics argue that eliminating violence through extreme separation introduces another form of harm, one less visible, but potentially lasting far beyond prison walls. Because the damage inside ADX is often psychological rather than physical, and psychological damage rarely announces itself dramatically. It develops quietly, over years. Some former inmates described becoming hypersensitive to sound after prolonged isolation. Others struggled to tolerate crowds or ordinary conversation after being transferred out of the facility. Noise that most people ignore suddenly felt overwhelming. Shared spaces created anxiety. Simple social interaction became stressful. The human mind adapts to silence when silence becomes permanent enough. And once adaptation occurs, returning to ordinary environments can feel disorienting. For inmates eventually transferred to lower security prisons after years at ADX, the transition is often difficult. A shared cafeteria may feel chaotic. Open movement inside a prison yard can feel unpredictable or threatening. Isolation changes perception. That transformation may become one of ADX Florence's most lasting effects. Even correctional officers working inside the facility experience a version of the prison's emotional atmosphere. Unlike traditional prisons, there are fewer casual interactions between staff and inmates. Communication remains procedural, measured, professional. Every movement follows protocol. Every exchange occurs within a structure built around security first. Some officers describe the work as controlled and orderly. Others acknowledge the psychological distance required to function daily inside such an environment. Because ADX houses inmates whose crimes shock the country, terrorists, violent offenders, organized crime figures, and prisoners considered too dangerous for standard federal institutions. Staff operate within constant awareness of that reality. And over time, the silence affects everyone inside the building, not only those behind steel doors. Yet even in a prison designed around separation, human beings still search for meaning. Some inmates dedicate themselves to education. Coursework is delivered through the slot in the cell door. Completed assignments are returned the same way. There are no classrooms, no discussions, no shared academic spaces. Only solitary learning. Others turn toward religion, meditation, or rigid exercise routines to maintain structure. Some memorize books or legal documents simply to keep their minds active. A few spend years studying case law in hopes of appealing convictions or sentence conditions. These routines may appear small from the outside. Inside ADX, they become lifelines. Because without structure, time itself becomes dangerous. In ordinary life, people measure time through events, conversations, celebrations, relationships, changes in environment. Inside ADX, repetition removes many of those markers. Days become difficult to separate from one another. Wake, eat, read, exercise, sleep, repeat, month after month, year after year. For inmates serving life sentences, the repetition becomes permanent. There is no future release date organizing the mind around eventual freedom. Some prisoners stop counting years entirely. Others hold on to routine with intense discipline because routine becomes the only remaining form of control they personally possess. And then there are the moments when outside connection disappears completely. Letters stop arriving. Phone calls become less frequent. Family members grow older or move on emotionally. Sometimes children who once visited behind reinforced glass become adults before seeing the inmate again. Sometimes parents die while sentences continue. Inside the prison, there is no ceremony marking those losses. No pause in routine. The lights still turn on at the same hour. Meals still arrive through the slot. The schedule continues without interruption. That emotional detachment is part of what makes ADX Florence different from almost every other prison in America. The facility does not rely on visible intimidation to maintain authority. It relies on separation so complete that eventually the outside world itself begins feeling distant. And despite decades of debate, the deeper ethical questions surrounding ADX remain unresolved. Supporters argue the prison protects correctional staff and prevents dangerous inmates from coordinating violence. Critics question whether prolonged solitary confinement creates irreversible psychological harm. Both sides point to evidence. Both sides claim safety as the goal, but they define safety differently. For some, safety means preventing physical violence at all costs. For others, safety also includes preserving mental stability and human dignity even during incarceration. ADX Florence sits directly at the center of that debate. The prison remains active today in the Colorado desert, quiet and heavily controlled. The mountains beyond the facility still rise against the horizon. Concrete walls still stand unchanged beneath the dry western sky. Inside, electronically controlled doors continue opening and closing according to schedule. And behind those doors are human beings living in near total isolation, some for years, some for decades. Some inmates spend their time reflecting. Others resist. Others slowly disappear into routine. The prison itself does not shout its power. It does not need to. ADX Florence was built to contain the uncontrollable, a place where silence replaces chaos and separation replaces ordinary prison life. Whether that system represents justice, necessity, or something far more troubling depends largely on who is asked. But one truth remains impossible to ignore. Inside America's most isolated Supermax prison, the greatest punishment is not always the concrete walls or steel doors. It is what happens when a human being is left alone with silence for too long.